Hi, I'm David Kessler. I'm a grief and loss specialist, and I'm here with Jayson Greene, the author of Once More We Saw Stars. And it's a beautiful, beautiful book that I wanted to talk to him about, that he and I have a personal connection in this world.
We do, yes.
Let's start with that.
Oh gosh, it's such an interesting story to look back on from this vantage point. But I met you, well, I was a member of your audience. I went to a grief retreat that you ran in Kripalu Institute, which is in Massachusetts. And this was about 6 months after my daughter Greta had passed. And my wife and I were looking around for things that we could do. And we didn't even know yet what those things would look like. We just knew that we needed to do something that felt like it was addressing the grief we felt head on, because we had just been living with it day to day and going to work and coming home and eating dinner and watching television. And at some point we looked at each other and said, we haven't done anything in 6 months now to commemorate Greta or to learn to live with her spirit. And so I think my wife was just looking on Google, probably Googled grief retreat. It was probably as simple as that. And said, you know, there's this workshop at Kripalu. My wife and I had always, Stacy and I had always loved doing yoga together. And she said, well, you know, I've always wanted to go here. And she looked at your name and said, well, David Kessler, oh, well, look at, he's actually a grief expert and he's written books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And we both said, oh, well, that sounds pretty good. But we did not know how we felt about going to a yoga institute for a weekend where we couldn't escape if we needed to. We were, you know, and not group people by nature. I think it's fair to say neither Stacy nor I were very social, but neither of us were really a part of any sort of religious community growing up, and we're the people sitting in the back usually. And so we pushed through that and we drove to Kripalu and came to your grief retreat, which you ran with a man named Paul Denniston, who did grief yoga, and a woman named Maureen Hancock, who was a medium. And Stacy and I spent so much time obsessing over what the medium in particular was going to do. And I think it was sort of a focal point for our fears, for the unknown. What does our healing journey look like? And what is it going to make of us? What kind of people are we going to become? And those sorts of questions were going in the background of our minds as we made silly jokes about what Maureen Hancock, the medium, might do. Is she going to fall on the floor and thrash? Is she going to speak in tongues? We were literally referencing Whoopi Goldberg in the movie Ghost. That's, you know, how silly we were being, but we were scared. I think it's fair to say we were both scared. And within 5 minutes of sitting down in the conference room where the session started, you said something beautiful.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell my rule, but okay.
I am, but I'm prefacing it because I think...
I'm going to say something nice before I say the rule.
Yes, exactly. You said something to the effect of everyone in this room, because it was not just a retreat for people who had lost children, it was for bereavement.
And you don't have to be spiritual of any nature to go there.
Absolutely,
it's just,
absolutely. Yes, it's all kinds.
Everyone's welcome,
Everyone's welcome. Stacy and I sat in the back, literally, and near the double doors where we, you know, we said to each other, if this makes us uncomfortable, we can sneak out. And
didn't you even have a code word?
We had a code word. We had a safe word for your grief retreat. That's how scared we were of beginning this journey and what it would look like. And so you said, everyone in this room has had someone disappear. So I only have one rule, which is that you can't just get up and leave without saying anything. And Stacy and I looked at each other, and it was like we heard the locks click. We said, oh no. But in a way, it was the most beautiful beginning because it committed us to something. And the weekend that we met you, and you know, we met you along with 60 other people, you know, you were administering to this large group of people who had all manner of loss. But it was the beginning for us of the journey that really I chose to trace in this book. It was the first moment of anything like healing that either Stacy or I felt in the weeks and months after our daughter died. And we took that with us. We took that back with us into the city. And we could talk about that weekend more in depth. But basically we came away having felt like there is a sense in which Greta is still in our lives. And seeing you and going to that weekend, and I think for everyone who's grieving, there's a different starting point. But for us, that weekend with you was our starting point. You know, and from there, it grew. I wrote a book. I mean, to put it simply, I sat down and started writing I had been writing, but after that weekend, I think it took on a new clarity what I was doing for myself and for Greta. I was writing our story. And I contacted you about a year after to say, by the way, I was in your audience.
You're going to be in the book.
And I wrote a book, and guess what? There's an
Right,
entire
right.
chapter with just you in it.
Well, and there may be people who are just wondering about the book, who are watching and
Yes.
or are dealing with loss themselves. First of all, let me just say, so incredible. And it's not just a book about loss, it's a book about life. And I'll tell you, there's things that I have taken away from it that I'm still applying every day in life.
Oh, wow.
I mean, one of them, and I'll just say it so people aren't know he's just going, oh, it's about life too. It is, you say part of our job, I think you were talking about Greta at the time, part of our job for our loved ones is to clear a path for whatever they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I really have taken that in, and I've really taken that in
Yeah.
and thought about my job with everyone in my life is to clear a path for them to have what they want.
Yes.
And so this is such a beautiful, beautiful
Thank
book.
you.
I just want to share one thing early on, is after the accident, you talk about being given a pamphlet or something that had a list of cry as much as you want. And you say, these are my first set of instructions on how to breathe on this new planet. And I think everyone who's experienced grief on a deep level feels like they've suddenly been thrown into this new world that now separates you from everyone else.
Yeah, I think we felt that most acutely, and that was in the hospital. So Greta was struck by a falling brick. I feel like I should probably back up and just say what happened to us. And, you know, that's where this story begins, is our daughter was 2, and she was struck by a falling brick from an 8-story windowsill on the Upper West Side. She was with my wife Stacy's mother at the time. And so we rushed to the hospital where we met with her, and she was on life support. And so that, the moment you just alluded to, is shortly after we had been told that her prognosis was fatal and that she wouldn't wake up. I think we had an intimation, but that was when we had been told incontrovertibly that our daughter was dying or dead and would not wake up. And we began making sense of what we would do. And so the person who brought us that pamphlet was someone who came to us from the organ donation team, because we decided we wanted to donate her organs to make something come of it. And I think even in the moment of acute crisis, there was some sort of desire for a life to come out of it, out of this void that had opened up in our lives. Even with Greta still there in front of us on life support, we said, you know, this has to mean something. And that moment, I think I would never have had the wherewithal in the moment of trauma to think this thought rationally.
Stacy did, though.
Stacy did. Stacy did turn to me and she said, maybe this way it won't be for nothing.
Right.
Which was a remarkable moment of clarity for me. And it gave me such, it only deepened my respect for her and her sense of emotional clarity, especially in moments of
In
deep
that
trauma.
worst moment, to try to make this meaningful, to make it find meaning.
And to
is
not to
just-
succumb immediately to a sort of nihilistic sense that nothing means anything. I think both of us resisted that on a sort of cellular level. We did not want it to be that way. It went against our natures. And I think you learn a lot about your nature, your inherent nature, when something truly traumatic happens to you. And what we learned was that we very much wanted life to be meaningful, even in the absence of our daughter, even in the presence of something as seemingly meaningless as this freak accident. And so I could look back on that moment that you referenced when I was at my daughter's bedside, and I knew intellectually and emotionally that she would never wake up, and this was my last time with her in my life. And even in that moment, some part of my brain was mobilizing for what would come next. And that moment was an example of some deeper part of me, some subconscious part of my brain latching onto it. And just like it says in the book, it was a set of instructions. It was too foggy from grief and pain and trauma to think that thought clearly, but looking back on it now with the benefit of hindsight, it is very clearly what I was doing. And I think that everyone who does go through trauma has a moment where they decide, well, there's not one moment. I think there are probably many moments along the path to healing where you decide what this event is going to mean for you. And there's a moment very close to the trauma where you've made one decision, and then maybe a little further down the line, maybe a few months out, maybe a year out, where you make another decision. And it's almost like a re-upping of your contract with your own life. What does this mean for me?
Right. And that's something I want to talk about, that you and I have had a discussion about. You are a writer who was thrown into grief. I was a grief specialist who was thrown into writing books. So it's sort of, we come to it from two different things. But one of the things I admire so much is your writing is just brilliant. And you take us into the mind, your bantering mind. And we get to see, as I think it is in all of us, the moments of hopelessness, that just this horrible, horrible, cruel, random act happens in the world.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that hopelessness seems to be battling hope.
Yeah.
And hope seems to win. Between you and Stacy together, hope seems to win.
Yeah. Well, we chose it.
Because we're all battling that.
We are all battling that. But I should say, too, that there's a moment, and I would imagine, although I can't speak for anyone else, that this would speak to people in deep grief and bereavement. There's a moment when you sort of see, because one of the most common, I think, aspects of deep trauma is this sort of out-of-body experience where you feel like you are watching yourself. And I think many people report that sort of sensation. And you see yourself with an uncanny clarity, and it's a clarity that you, thankfully, are not afforded in your daily life, because life doesn't go to such extremes that requires it. But I remember very vividly looking down and almost seeing my life branching out before me as a set of options, all equally viable at that moment. And one of them was choosing to be hopeful. But I wouldn't say that looking back on that, the sensation I felt was that I was staring at a forked path between hope and hopelessness, and hope won. It was more that I felt myself at the branching of multiple paths. One of them, quite frankly, including ending my own life. I don't think that's an uncommon thought for people who lose children. And I think it's important to say that as well, to reduce the stigma around the idea that you would then regard your life as inherently worthless, because it's a scary thought. I think anyone who's ever had that thought is frightened by it. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that out of all those options, that was also present for me. I saw that option very clearly, and out of those options, I chose hope. But like I said earlier, I don't know that I made that decision incontrovertibly. There were many moments along that path where I had to re-choose hope as a path.
And that comes out in here. And one of the things you mention is sometimes it's actual suicidal thoughts that we have to, really get people help.
Yes.
Sometimes it's just such a deep yearning of, my loved one has died and I just want to be where they are, and this existence holds no more meaning for me.
Right.
And you're exactly right. When you read the book, it isn't like there's a huge fork in the road on chapter 58 and you go down hopeful.
Yeah.
It is clear. You take us through each choice.
Right.
And the choices, there's never a sign that says hope, but there's moments we're going,
right.
He took the one that's a little more hopeful.
A little more hopeful. I think that I wanted the book to feel incremental in a way, because I wanted it to feel like it felt to me, which is that like life. It felt incremental.
Right.
It felt like life. It felt like a mixture of mundane and unbearable moments mixed with transcendent ones. And I think that's the texture of someone's experience. And if there was one thing I wanted to capture in this book, it was the texture of lived experience of grief.
And the walking around New York, having screaming places. That you just had places where you knew you could scream, because who in grief hasn't wanted to scream?
Well, you taught me that again. That came right back for Kripalu. You had us pound pillows and scream. Right. And after I did that in a room full of strangers, I felt like I could do it anywhere.
In New York.
Yeah,
in New
but
York.
it's true. Having walked around the city and looked for places in this island of 8 million people where I could somehow scream and not be heard, and it was just a vent. It was another sort of way of releasing unwanted things inside of me. I hope that anyone who's going through deep pain can find a place to scream, because it is profoundly cathartic. It's just a physical act. It feels good when you are in pain to scream. It's a natural response. And it's funny that I had to be prompted to do that. I would not have, and there's the moment of grief, and everyone understands it's a primal reaction. But after that, when you're just hurting, why would you open your mouth and just scream? What's wrong with you at this moment that you should scream? And yet, there is a part of you that is screaming. And to scream at that moment is to acknowledge that part of you and to feel more alive, because that part of you has been screaming and you have been tuning it out on purpose to go about your life. And the simple act of venting that feeling for just a moment, to honor it, is to remember both that I'm in extreme pain, and one, that I'm in extreme pain, and two, that I'm alive.
And part of my work, I always feel like, is to give people permission to grieve and to have those feelings.
Yeah.
Whether it's deep sadness or crying or screaming or anger.
Right.
And you took us down all those roads. And I think this gives permission for all those feelings, and for hope, and for living again.
Yeah.
People in grief talk about telling the story, having to retell the story,
Yes.
not wanting to tell the story. What was it like for you? Number one, you were thrust into such a public event because it got so much notoriety when it happened.
Right.
The death of your sweet daughter, Greta. And then to now choose to share this with the world. And I think to really make meaning and honor her.
Thank you. I definitely felt that when she died, there was this complicated relationship with, how should I put this? There was a complicated relationship with the world's awareness that sprung up immediately. On the one hand, I felt nothing more than an instinctive desire to huddle inside, in a very basic sort of the way that a dog curls up somewhere when they're hurt. They don't want to be seen. And I felt that on some profound level. And there was a level at which some of the media attention surrounding the moment, although it died down after 48 hours, or, there was a frenzy in which the city was crawling up with news trucks up and down trying to find us. And looking back, I would say that felt like a background noise to our trauma more than anything else. I was only vaguely aware of it in the periphery of my awareness. And in all honesty, there's a moment in which being handed a problem to solve felt invigorating.
Right. Because you knew how to do that. I remember you talking about, I'm going to get this plan just in case that happens.
I had some authority.
I can fix that one.
I had some authority over that problem. You do this, you do that. It was like I was given the gift of having to use my executive functioning for something, and I took it. Right. So I think there was a moment in the trauma where it was overwhelming or surreal or confusing. The longer and harder and stranger relationship that sprang up in the wake of that was that many, many, many people who I knew, who I didn't know, who I barely knew, were acutely aware that I was suffering and that my family was suffering and that Greta was gone. And that was a longer and more complicated dynamic to work through, because I was acutely aware at the same time that I did not want to be suffering in public. I did not want to be suffering on a stage, and there's a sense in which I felt so profoundly exposed. I'm a private person, despite having written a book. I think some private people tend to overcompensate as writers by putting more of themselves into their book than they would say to someone's face. But in the moment, I felt very much like the privacy of my life had been breached. And on the other hand, I was also aware that so many people don't get what we got, which is to say, people have their children die every day, and they're left to pick up the pieces on their own in relative silence. Perhaps they have family members who grieve with them, but the world seemed to react to Greta's death in a way that was almost commensurate with what we felt inside. And I was also aware that there was a strange sort of, I don't want to use the word privilege, but there was a strange sort of gratitude to be found in some of that. There was support there. There was support there. And so I felt like I was navigating these complicated feelings of resentment sometimes. Don't come up to me and ask me how I am. And then deep need, please come up to me and ask me how I am. And you're fighting with yourself. I was fighting with myself between those two urges all of the time. And so when it came time, I started writing for myself, I should say, the words that are in this book. Some of them came from a journal, a document I opened on my phone 2 days after I got home from the hospital. I was writing down words for myself as a way of continuing to exist, and to put it in a very dramatic but true, I think, context, days after. Some of those sentences are verbatim in the book. It wasn't until months later that I decided that what I was doing with these words was writing the story of Greta. And then even months later after that I decided that not only was it the story of Greta, but that I was writing a book. And at some point, Stacy became pregnant again. And then this became a larger mission, which was to create this book so that it existed in our family, almost in a place where Greta wasn't. You know, Greta had disappeared into this void. And it was going to be so hard to account for that void in our family. But maybe if I carved something back out of it that contained some of her essence, I could show it to my family. I could show it to my son at some point in his life. Or more importantly, I could have done the work of telling myself the story so that when it came time to tell him, I could do it with clear eyes, and he would know that he wasn't living in a world that was haunted by someone he will never meet. And that became the work of the book. And I think that overrode any concern I had about exposure with this book and with putting the privacy of my deepest grief in this book. Because if it wasn't in here, it was going to be leaking out everywhere, because it already felt like it was. Does that make sense?
And one thing I remember you and I talked about when your son was born is sort of about how to hold Greta in his world. And that you didn't want your son to also get hit by that brick.
I did say that, yeah.
And I think the idea that this is a way of, so he's not the kid whose sister got hit by a brick.
Right.
This is a whole context you're giving him and the world for loss and for life and for living.
One of the things that
What a legacy to her. I just want to,
Thank you.
what a legacy to her.
I hope so. I mean, I love that her picture is on the book. That means a lot to me, because it means that wherever the book is, she is on some level. And it's a picture of her that I took. It's, you know, we were out together at the beach. It's the opening scene of the book, and that's her walking on Coney Island. And it means a lot to me that she's there on it, because I do feel like it is sort of, for me, a talisman, a little talisman for her out in the world. And I also, I can't stress how important it is to me that the biggest lesson I learned was that all grief is the same. There, I think, is a quality that is different to certain kinds of grief. I think there is a uniqueness to grieving a child, but I don't think that it is a foreign emotion from grieving a parent.
There's a uniqueness to grieving a brother. There's a uniqueness to grieving a dog. There's, you know, they're all unique, different relationships.
And yet, the inherent source of that feeling is so universal. And Stacy and I felt so alone in our grief, like we had entered into some horrible alternate dimension, a new planet, as I said. Like we were walking the steps, that we were stepping on the surface of some barren planet that only we could see. It looked like Earth to everyone else, but only we could see what the landscape truly looked like. And there's a reason I use space travel as a metaphor, because nothing else could evoke the barrenness that we felt. And yet, everyone who has lost someone has visited that planet and knows what it feels like to step their foot on that planet. And the first time that we realized that was when we came to Crip Hollow and met 60 other people who were grieving their husbands, who were grieving their children, who were grieving adult children, who were grieving any number of loved ones who were on the same planet with us. And to know that was the most powerful thing of all. And so to me, the universality of grief was the most meaningful connection I made. My biggest lesson was that there was nothing inherently special. Special is the wrong word. Nothing inherent, well, in a way, I think we felt charged with this terrible significance. We were this couple to whom this thing had happened. And so, of course, no one could understand. And that was not a comforting thought at all. To realize that there are many, many people in the world, in fact, everyone has had someone disappear, as you say, in their lives, can understand.
And you talked about it earlier that I think is so brilliant and comes out in the book, and you're mentioning it here, that because of the tragedy of Greta dying, the world gave you sort of the full respect of grief and the full sort of due in so many ways that someone out there who's grieving their mother who died,
Sure.
or their brother who died, or someone who died by a death by suicide,
Yeah.
or an overdose, or some accident that didn't, quote, appear quite as tragic, their grief isn't quite as important or
as acknowledged
or
or
acknowledged
visible.
or supported.
Yeah.
And you are so clear about the grief is grief. The
Yeah.
pain is pain.
And that's, to me, that's really the most important thing. I mean, there are people out there who may have lost their mother and their boss doesn't even know. They come back to work the next day, or they take a few days off. Maybe they have an email or a card and that's it. The grief then is their own. And I was really conscious of that writing that book. I wanted that feeling inside a book. And that's why the title has the word "we" in it. It was really, really important to me.
Once more, we saw stars.
Once more, we saw stars. I mean, the line it's the last line of Dante's Inferno. It's when Virgil and Dante are emerging from the underworld, and the stars they see are the aperture exiting hell, and the first glimpse of stars that they see. And when Stacy and I found that phrase together, we both thought it was so wonderfully resonant. But what I loved about it personally was that as the writer of this book, it was not a story about one person. Because this book isn't the story about one person. It's not about me and it's not about Greta.
You take us through the grief journey and all the people you meet
Right.
with all their different losses, and
Yeah.
some things work, some things don't.
Some things don't.
Some things seem solid, some things seem silly.
Some
you know,
people
just
disappear.
Like life.
Some family members disappear for a while and go down their own path, and then come back, and everyone's on their own path.
And one of the things I think I hear so frequently from people who are dealing with loss is that it makes other people uncomfortable.
Yes, it does.
And you
Yeah.
dealt with that, and we saw that so
Yeah.
many times.
Yeah, and that's something else that I can really relate to. I can relate to that. I think anyone, even if you've had something awful happen to you and you've experienced that discomfort from people who are afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, who do say the wrong thing, it's so palpable, that discomfort. And there's no way to comfort someone from the position of the person undergoing the pain. And yet, if there was one message I wished I could transmit to every single person who was standing in front of me, who felt like they didn't know what to say, was, you're already helping, because you are here.
It's the grief must be witnessed.
It's true.
I don't
It's
have the right
true.
words, but I'm here with you.
And I have had that. I mean, even since the accident, it doesn't mean that you are suddenly fluent in the language of trauma. And all
So
of
that
a sudden,
you know how to support everyone else.
I'm not
in
a
the
black
world.
belt
Right,
in knowing
right.
how to comfort people who've been through trauma at all. I mean, I've had people who've had horrible losses since Greta passed, and I have felt that superstitious fear that is very human nature, of the fear to reach out, the fear to say the wrong thing. And I would love for the stigma on that feeling to come down a bit, because I think it's part of responding to someone's pain. I think it's part of human nature to respond to someone's pain, at least in part, with fear, because pain is scary. But I don't think there's anything wrong about that. Some people are shamed
Right.
for that feeling. Oh, I should want to go over there. Why don't I want to go comfort them? What is wrong with me that I'm afraid of this person since something happened to them? And if you can just acknowledge that feeling and then
And
best it.
we have this primal thing that pain, that loss could be contagious.
Yes.
Like
yes.
what happened to someone could happen to me.
Could happen to me.
And if I sort of avoid them,
Mm-hmm.
I'm keeping a seatbelt on.
Exactly.
And maybe not in this world, probably not. That will,
Well, and that
when
was-
people
yeah.
don't understand grief, I often think, well, someday they will. It will
Yeah.
come to everyone.
It
It will
does.
come to everyone.
It does. And it's interesting that you say that about the keeping the seatbelt on, because one of the hardest things to parse with Greta's death was the why and the how. In some ways, the fact that it was a freak accident, and there were reasons why the brick fell, but also it was just an inherently sort of freak moment. there was, there are lots of ways that horrible accidents occur, but there was no real meaning to ascribe, and there was no takeaway. There was no, I guess what I'm fumbling around to say, there was no we should have,
Right.
if only we had. And in some ways, being robbed of the illusion of control was so hard that there were moments in my deep grief where I wished, and this is such a perverse sounding thing to say, that we had done something wrong to cause her death. Because then, and that sounds so monstrous said out loud, but what I mean by that is that at least then I would have been able to blame myself. At least
There would have been a focus.
I would have established a connection between cause and effect that would have kept my understanding of the universe in check.
I neglected this, so that happened.
I was punished. We were punished because we failed to do something.
And
having to learn that there was no punishment, there was indifference or lack of meaning was the toughest part of it.
and yet you finding meaning. And the other thing I want to mention
Yes.
is there's never a satisfying why. I mean, I can
Of
tell you
course.
from all my years of working with people
No
who
one's ever
have
had
those
a
things, there's
satisfying
never
why.
a satisfying why.
Yeah.
And yet, even though the brick was so random, and it's also, there is no one to blame, your mother-in-law seemed like she had some survivor's guilt,
She witnessed it. I mean, and
which she was with Greta when
she was with Greta, and I'll tell you that even though I am Greta's father, and though I had to mourn my own child, I still flinch from even trying to imagine what she experienced. And in some ways, I'm deeply in awe of the fact that she has come from a place of holding her dying granddaughter in her arms, who had just been hit in the head with a brick on her watch, to watching my son. That to me is a tremendous, tremendous testament to someone's will to survive and to make meaning out of their lives and to continue to live.
Right.
She watches my son Harrison twice a week for entire days.
And going back to the incremental pieces you talk about in the story,
Yeah,
it's not this straight thing that, oh, she's with Harrison and everything's great.
exactly.
It is, we see her not wanting to walk outside anymore.
Yeah,
We see
it's
her
real.
saying, no, well, he's never going to see his grandmother, like, because I'm the bad luck here.
Right.
I mean, you take us through, I mean, everyone we might be in grief, we see in here.
Wow, that means a lot.
We
It
see,
means a lot.
whether
Yeah.
it's the person who's going to alcohol to deal with their loss or the person
Mm-hmm.
who's, PTSD. I mean, we see everyone here.
That's beautiful to hear because I do think that everyone's story was sort of swirled together. We were all sort of thrown together on ourselves and we weren't blasted apart. I think some people are blasted apart and wind up feeling very alone. We were thrown together on our own resources and onto each other, and I think we learned that we are inherently people who require the support of other people to live.
And it was messy.
And it was messy, of course. It wasn't.
Life's messy.
Life is messy.
It wasn't a
yeah.
hallmark.
Again, the texture of grief. There were fights. There were, and also, another part of the lived texture of grief that I really wanted to capture. And it sounds funny to say this. There are moments of humor. That sounds weird and ghastly in a way, but life remains funny. Life remains funny because you are always attempting to do something and failing to do something. In every day of your life, you are trying and failing to do something, and in that gap, there is always an opportunity to laugh at yourself or to laugh at a situation. And that is another thing that Stacy and I rediscovered. Our own discomfort sitting in the back of your session as we faced our diffidence,
And there's no coffee at the time. There's
there's
coffee now at Kripalu.
There's coffee at Kripalu,
If you go to
everybody.
Grieving Believing, there's coffee now.
They have
But
put coffee in the cafeteria. There's a whole scene
right.
where Stacy's horrified that they only have herbal tea.
first loss, then no coffee. But
Exactly,
let me just say, one of the things I admire and envy of you as a writer,
That's nice.
that as I read this, it's exactly what you say. First of all, as a writer and a reader, I know if you put something into design to get a laugh, it would fall and it would be hideous. And you're sitting there reading, and I'm reading this book, and I'm in these just deep moments, and then you're telling something, and I laugh out loud. And I
that's
even
nice.
go, oh, I shouldn't be laughing at this moment, but it is so funny.
I look forward to the first
And-
moment I see someone on the subway reading this book and just laughing their head off.
Because there's
But yes,
such
there's moments
humor in it, and you don't expect there to be humor, and you're not creating it, it just is. And you weave it into life because it's how life happens.
Well, that's what you said, right? The word you used, unexpected. There is always humor in the unexpected. There's tragedy in the unexpected, and there's humor in the unexpected. There is there's an equation there, and if we hadn't been able to laugh at our own discomfort, I don't think we would have healed. I don't think we would have learned how to heal. Part of rediscovering that life was meaningful was rediscovering that things were funny, that life was funny. It was crucial. I mean, the fact that I got into a fight with a grief group moderator at my first meeting, that's ridiculous. There's nothing about that that's
I cannot
admirable,
tell you
and
what
only
was
things
right,
about it
right.
that, you know.
But you're reading it going, oh my God, they're fighting in a grief group. It's like how, you
I mean, I
just
felt
can
like
imagine that
yeah,
scene.
I felt like I was in an episode of my own sitcom, like Curb Your Enthusiasm, where like, did you hear what you just said? And I couldn't keep myself.
Seinfeld episode.
Yes.
You're like, wait a minute, could that, and it's just
Yeah.
so authentic, and people can, relate
Yeah.
to it.
And I would hope that would, I wrote a book about something so sad, inherently sad. It's about the death of my daughter, but I want the book to be a testament to more profoundly hopeful things, and that's the message I keep coming back to when I tell people about this book. And I say, my deepest hope is that this book will make you cry, but that it will leave you in a good place. It will sort of escort you out of that place into somewhere else, because that was the journey that Stacy and I went on together as a family.
And I think the other myth you bust in here, and I don't even know that you say this, maybe you do, but as we go on this journey with you, I know in the grief world, there's almost a disloyalty to our loved ones who have died to live again.
Sure.
And in this book, you help reframe that we see living again is all about honoring Greta.
Yeah, and I think everyone eventually arrives at that realization. This person would have wanted me to live. This person
I
would
wish
have
they
wanted
did.
me.
They don't always.
They don't. Right.
They don't.
That's,
I wish they did.
I wish they did.
I hope this will help them.
That's meaningful to hear. Yeah. Well, and on that note, I can say that it was also a moment when I had to ask Greta's forgiveness for choosing to live again. Coming back to that moment where I saw all the forked paths. One of them was hopelessness. One of them was hope, but not clear hope. The idea that there could be hope. That's really what that path represented. The possibility of hope. And then it was oblivion. And oblivion was where Greta was. And so by not choosing oblivion, I was, in essence, emotionally speaking at least, committing my first act of disloyalty. And I went for a walk in the neighborhood about 8 days after Greta died. And I would go for walks to talk to her because I think I felt much more in tune with her spirit when I was outside and looking up at the sky and the trees. And I very vividly recall watching the wind in the trees and sort of having that sense that you get of there's like a palpable energy kind of coursing through you. And I would never put a name on that energy. I just know it when I feel it. And I talked to her, and I told her that I was very sorry. And I wasn't apologizing in that moment for what had happened to her. I was apologizing to her because I knew I was going to have to forget her a little bit. And those are the words I used. I said, I'm sorry. I'm choosing to stay here. And what that means is that I'm going to have to forget you for just a little bit. Not completely, but because you aren't here anymore, and I am. And I've chosen to be here now for a long time, probably. No one knows how long they have, but for as long as I can. That means that I'm letting go of you while I'm still here. And I needed to seek atonement from her before I could even begin that process.
And there is a line that goes with it. I don't know if I could find it, but there is a line where you're talking about that, but you also say, as you're talking about forgetting her and forgetting those moments and the memories are fading, you said something about, and I'm going to have to bring you into the present now.
Yes.
So I want to, as people
Right.
are hear this, they're going, forgetting your
Forget.
daughter who died. And you talk about, that's going to diminish the past,
Yes, that's
but I'm
true.
always going to bring you into the present with me. And that, just when you go through that, it's like, because I think everyone in grief
Yeah.
has felt that desperation of the forgetting happening and the memories slipping and the disloyalty
Yeah.
of not living
Yeah.
in the past and committing to a future.
Yeah.
And you wrestled with that in front of us.
I do. And
you-
forget is such a violent sounding word. It is.
And it's really clear when you read the book, there's no forgetting. There's no forgetting.
Well,
And
here
it
she is on this
Right,
book.
right.
But yes, but the journey that you mentioned, I mean, that step of that journey was yet another. I could not do all of those. I could not heal in all of those ways simultaneously. I think I was possessed by this drive to power through the grief process, as if I could hit fast forward on the stages of grief. But unfortunately, nothing works along those timelines, and
They're not linear,
and they're not linear, exactly.
and they're not a map for grief.
They're not a map for grief, exactly right.
And yet they do seem to be a pattern that some people fall into, and if it works for you, great, and if it doesn't, that's fine also.
Exactly, which is also a very important thing that I absorbed. But what I meant to say was that the step that you mentioned a minute ago, where I didn't forget Greta, but I did let go of her memory so that I could bring her into the present with me. Those two things were separate realizations. I wish they could have happened at the same time in some ways, because that would have closed the gap between these two moments in my life where I was hurting very deeply. But unfortunately, I had to, in the moment of committing to life again, let go. And it felt like I was letting go of like something holding her so I could move forward. Because I knew that at some point in the future, I would rediscover her on my own terms, on her own terms. And it wasn't until Harrison was born and we visited the park where there's a tree in her honor, and we sat down, that we sort of realized that we had arrived at that next stage. And that is where we started to tell stories about Greta's life. And we didn't stop ourselves so much as we sort of came to the realization as we were talking that these stories were from a very small blip of what Greta's existence would mean in our lives. Yes, they were the totality of her time here on Earth with us, but that they weren't going to be enough to sustain us for the rest of our lives. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's too metaphysical to parse, but what I mean to say is that we had to make new memories with her somehow. And we had to discover some creativity in how to do that.
And for her to live in the present.
Right, with us. And so we invite her to places. And that might sound creepy. What I mean is that we invoke her spirit. On her, what would have been her 4th birthday, we sat down in the park with our son Harrison and basically invited Greta to sit with us, and not in so many words, but invited her spirit to be with us so that when we look back on that day, it would be its own new memory of Greta's presence with us. And that was a way of shifting our dynamic, because we are still a family, and that's important too. We are still a family. Greta is still our daughter. We still have 2 children. Just one of them's not here. Yeah.
I know what our wrap up could be if you're ready for that.
I think so.
All right. This is just such a wonderful book and
Thank
so
you, David.
meaningful. And I remember when you called me
Yeah.
and you sort of described, I'm the guy who had the daughter, and I said, Greta, and you were like, you remember?
Oh, I don't. Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember what I said, but Greta's unforgettable.
It's beautiful.
And we fall in love with her in this book, and we go through her life in this book and her loss, and you bring us out the other end too. And I feel like Greta lives in the world and will live in the world. And just the idea that you talked about her picture, you talk about the places she would never see. you're going to be in a million bookstores and see Greta's there waiting for you.
Yeah, I love that thought.
And
Yeah.
she's going to be in all of our hearts.
Thank you, David.
So thank you for this.
Thank you so much.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Please read it. Sad, funny, it's life.